Got to watch your polling booths, because I hear too many stories about Pennsylvania, certain areas. I hear too many bad stories, and we can't lose an election because of you know what I'm talking about. So go and vote, and then go check out areas, because a lot of bad things happen, and we don't want to lose for that reason.
Trump is at it again, raising the possibility of a rigged election, even urging his supporters in Pennsylvania to monitor the polls on Election Day, whatever that means. What he failed to mention is the actual illegal voter suppression that is occurring right now in Wisconsin, where early voting has already begun in some counties. A bombshell report out this week in The Nation magazine has exposed that the Department of Motor Vehicles is failing to provide voter IDs to those who need them to vote. According to The Nation, two African-American voters, Zach Moore and Claudel Boyd, who brought multiple documents with them to the DMV confirming their identities, were still turned away without the necessary voter ID. Molly McGrath of Vote Riders, which helps people get voter IDs, accompanied one of those men to the DMV. Let's listen to their exchange with department employees.
I'm just wondering how that would work. If you initiate the petition process, do you get an ID for voting?
You don't get anything right away. You don't get anything.
Okay, so even if we start the petition process and it takes 8 weeks,
right,
he won't be able to vote.
Right. Well, I don't know. They're working on that, so it's kind of up in the air right now. So if you want more information, we get you to the supervisor over at window 3 while we do that.
2 days after this story was published, a federal judge ordered the state of Wisconsin to investigate its voter ID process. And joining me now is Ari Berman, who brought us this story in The Nation magazine, and he's the author of Give Us the Ballot, the modern struggle for voting rights in America. Ari, thank you so much for being here. And I want to start where we ended there. A federal judge ordering Wisconsin to investigate itself. How in the world would that work?
So basically what a federal judge said is that Wisconsin needs to investigate its own DMV and report back immediately on why people are not getting the voter IDs as required by law. Because the big picture here, Joy, is that 300,000 registered voters in Wisconsin, 9% of the electorate, do not have strict forms of voter ID. And the court specifically relaxed the voter ID law in that state to say that anyone who doesn't have a birth certificate or that kind of documentation, if they go to the DMV to get a voter ID, they're supposed to get a certificate for voting within 6 business days. But we interviewed multiple black voters. We obtained tapes from the DMV that show that people are not being offered the certificate for voting. They're not being given voter ID, and they're being told that this might take until 8 weeks when the election is already over for them to get the IDs they need to vote.
And Ari, were you able to check in majority white counties to see if the same thing is happening?
Well, it seems to be a failure across the state, because Vote Riders, which is helping people get voter IDs, went to 10 different DMVs, and only 3 of them even knew about these certificates for voting. But it's clearly a problem in the African-American community. I have talked to multiple black voters now who do not have voter IDs, even though they've been able to vote their entire life and are not being turned away from the polls. So this is clearly hitting some voters more than others. This is exactly what Republicans wanted to happen in Wisconsin. They said they were, quote, giddy about the impact that the voter ID law would have on college campuses and neighborhoods around Milwaukee. They said that the voter ID law would allow Donald Trump to win the state. This has always been about political. Scott Walker and Republicans in Wisconsin passed this voter ID law to try to help themselves politically and hurt those people that disagree with them.
Yeah, and you write in your piece that it appears that Wisconsin is violating multiple court orders by not promptly giving eligible citizens free IDs or certificates to vote. And Lawrence Tribe, tweeting about your story on Friday night, he said this. He said, Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker should be held in contempt of the federal court 6-day voter ID order unless his administration complies immediately. Is there a way to hold the government of Wisconsin in contempt to force them to give people the IDs that they need to vote?
Well, you should ask Larry Tribe that. He's a more distinguished lawyer than I am. I just play one on TV. But basically, I think what the judge was saying to the state is that if you report back to me and I don't find what you're saying sufficient, I might be able to block this voter ID law. The only reason the Wisconsin voter ID law was upheld in the first place is because the state said they're going to give everyone IDs. Well, that clearly isn't happening. People are being disenfranchised. Early voting has already begun in places like Madison and Milwaukee and Green Bay, and yet people are being turned away from the polls. So this is a huge story, and I'm really happy you're covering this, Joy, because it needs a lot more national attention.
Yeah, and the thing is that, you know, it's easy to speculate that this voter ID law was passed in order to help Republicans electorally, but you actually have a Republican elected official on record saying it. I want to play Glenn Grothman, who is a Wisconsin state representative. He was speaking to WTMJ-TV. This was back on April 5th. Listen to what he said about this very law that we're talking about right now.
Take me forward to November. You know that a lot of Republicans since 1984 in the presidential races have not been able to win in Wisconsin. Why would it be any different for Ted Cruz or a Donald Trump?
Well, I think Hillary Clinton is about the weakest candidate the Democrats have ever put up. And now we have photo ID. And I think photo ID is going to make a little bit of a difference as well.
And Ari, have Republicans or leaders of these DMVs responded to your story in any way to justify what they're doing?
Well, Governor Walker was asked about this by the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and he said that A, he is investigating, and B, has the full tape been released? So he seemed to be questioning the motives of the people that released the tape. I have listened to all of these recordings at the DMV. They do not reflect well on Scott Walker and his administration. They passed this law not to crack down on voter fraud because there wasn't a single case of voter impersonation that Wisconsin presented in court. This was all about giving Republicans an advantage in elections, disenfranchising college students, African Americans, and low-income individuals who tend to vote for Democratic candidates.
Yeah, absolutely. Ari, stay with us. I want to bring in our panel. Back with me is Joan Walsh. Joining the table, Christina Greer, professor at Fordham University and author of Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream. Also back with me is Michelle Bernard. And Christina, I'm going to come to you first because, when you see this in North Carolina, when you see this in Ohio, when you see this in Wisconsin, not only 3 swing states, but 3 very closely contested states. Let's go through 3 polling numbers. Wisconsin in 2012, Romney versus Obama. Barack Obama 53, Mitt Romney 46, won Wisconsin. And then you come to what's happening today. Russ Feingold is poised to take away one of these Senate seats, crucial Senate seats, away from Ron Johnson. He's polling at 52 versus 42, up 10 points. And then you look at Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. Clinton is up 7 right now in the polling, 45 to 38. It's hard to not think that this is being done by these DMVs, by Republicans who are in charge of this state in order to change those results.
Right. What I think the real takeaway is, hopefully for all of your viewers, is that we really need to pay a lot more attention to these down ballot races. The governor and the state houses across this country, are slowly but surely, this is the Koch brothers and lots of, sort of right-wing Republican money, they have been putting so much time, energy, effort, and money into changing these state houses across the country to make them Republican, strong Republicans. So we see these numbers will probably shift, but in key states, but also in states where they're not necessarily swing states, we're seeing blue Democratic states slowly but surely getting Republican state houses, slowly but surely getting a Republican governor who may be a little bit more moderate. But when it comes to these sort of non-sexy issues, we're looking at this type of behavior, which is really frightening. So I would, ask voters to really think about not just galvanizing themselves about Trump and Clinton, but really thinking about some of these quote-unquote off-year elections that are really important, because we see these people getting elected with sometimes 5,000 or 6,000 voters. Yeah, and they're in charge of millions of dollars, but also our bodies, our children, and obviously our franchise.
Absolutely. And Joan, you had, to Christina's point, Democrats really give away half a dozen swing states in 2010. Right. Republicans increased those margins in the state house in 2014. So even in a reliably blue state like Wisconsin, Republicans were free to implement these laws that they're now directly using to keep particularly Black voters from getting to the polls.
Right. I mean, I think we also have to point out, it's an empirical point, it's a fact. This spate of laws began in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama, thanks to Black and brown and young and student voters. And so this has always been, it's been a Republican issue. It's always been a solution in search of a problem. It's the great white whale, we might say, of Republicanism, of Republican politics, that these Democrats send their people to the polls, they vote multiple times. In fact, really fun fact, I think one of the 2 examples of voter fraud in the last few years was a guy in my former town of Shore, Wisconsin, a Republican, who voted multiple times for Mitt Romney and voted multiple times for Scott Walker in the recall. Mm-hmm. So the people that we find over and over, even when we find these 5 cases of voter fraud, They're not
Stephen
majority.
Bannon.
Yeah, Stephen Bannon. They're not majority Democrats.
Right, and Michelle, I wonder how, particularly Republicans of color, but how Republicans attempt to justify this when there is no data to show that there is voter fraud that caused these laws, but there is data to show that Democrats can win in presidential years.
Well, first of all, Joy, they don't have any support whatsoever. And I want to point out quickly a really important point when we talk about what we're watching. The state senator that we saw on a clip a few moments ago on the program, Glenn Grothman, I have to tell you and the viewers that it's important to remember that this is also the same individual who, in explaining his opposition to the Equal Pay Act being enacted in the state of Wisconsin, stated literally that one could argue that money is more important to men than it is to women. So if we think about that in the context of the gender gap, meaning that we know a lot of women vote for Democrats. If we know that African Americans primarily vote for Democrats. If we look at the people who were on that tape in Wisconsin telling the voters and the American public that they had planned on voting for Hillary Clinton, but now they don't have an ID and will not be able to cast a vote during this election, there is no justification whatsoever. It appears that the Republican Party is literally channeling George Wallace from many, many years ago. And I'm almost wondering if we're going to get to a point where on November 8th, we literally see federal troops having to assist African American voters and women and others in voting during this election cycle.
And Christina, last point, we cannot lose sight of the fact that this is also being done in absence of the Voting Rights Act.
Yes, indeed. I mean, and this is what we cannot be ahistorical as a nation. Like, this is not just from 2008. This is sort of, when we think about the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Immigration Act as a triumvirate of acts, there has been a systematic rollback of these policies ever since they were enacted in 64 and 65. I mean, the Republicans have been organized. They couldn't do it all the time on the federal level, so they've been slowly but surely eroding away on these things on the state level. And,
yeah, absolutely.
We really need to be vigilant.
We really have to go, but Ari Berman, I got to give you the last word on this. Do you see any movement on the core issue here, which is that the protections of the Voting Rights Act have been stripped away, and this is the result?
I see movement in terms of courts pushing back, but I also see the impact of these voter suppression laws that 14 states, including Wisconsin, are going to have new restrictions in place for the first time. This is the first presidential election in 50 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. And we're already seeing the impact in Wisconsin of people being turned away from the DMV, turned away from the polls before we've even got to November 8th. So I'm extremely concerned about this problem now and in the lead up to the election.
Well, we really appreciate your reporting on this, Ari. Please keep it coming, and we'll keep you coming back, and we will try to keep our viewers updated on this. Check your registration. Make sure you have an ID. Double check, triple check that you're registered to vote. Joan Walsh and Michelle Bernard are sticking around. Thank you so much to Ari Berman, and Christina Greer. Thank you so much. All right, more AM Joy after the break.